Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Mokono Man at YouTube with another modelling video. Today we'll be reviewing the 0.3mm signature airbrush or the signature 3 or 103 depending on the code. This is a sponsorship video by Hearns Hobbies, and this is a line of airbrush that is exclusive to their range, very similar to the Hearns, but of a slightly higher quality. We're going to dismantle them, lube them up, talk about some maintenance points, paint some lines, and maybe even finish a model. Let's crack her open and see what comes in the box. So it comes in your fairly standard box, not much in the way of markings, eyedropper, and a very standard spanner for the nozzle. The airbrush is very standard, nice chrome finish with a black handle. Moving everything, and as always comes with the appropriate paperwork, 0.3mm, 7cc cup, pretty much the same instructions as the 0.2mm model, with detailed instructions of your parts catalogue and how it comes apart. The number of this is the SG-100, which is interesting, but whatever. So pulling apart the airbrush, a lot of you may or may not have seen my other airbrush review videos, including the 2mm version of this. We're going to pull it apart, get familiar with the parts, lubricate it up, and spray some lines. So every time you buy a new airbrush, or you're absolutely new to airbrushing, you need to be familiar with every single component, be able to pull it apart and put it back together multiple times. One of the most important pieces, which I've repeated a few times, is the needle. You need to make sure it comes out and it is not bent or touched or dropped in any way. And the second component is the nozzle. And you don't want the nozzle to touch anything or fall on anything while attached to the airbrush. Also, when pushing the needle in, you don't want to push too hard because it will split and go through. The needle and nozzle will need to be exchanged quite often. It uses the same needle as the Sparmax and the Hearns, so they're very easy to find, and they go for about $1 a piece on eBay. You do come with a wrench, and it wrenches right off. It's quite easy to take off. While putting it back on together, you have to be very careful, as you can shear the thread out and damage it that way. So when you put it back on, screw it as much as you can with your fingers, and then only tighten it with one finger at finger tight. It does not have to be very tight, as it's a very soft material. Next is the air solenoid. It's on quite tight, so if you ever need to untighten something, only on the edged bits, small pliers, good tool, quarter twist, and the rest can be done by fingers. It's nice and tight. Can use a little lubricant in all of the threads, and then we undo the rear trigger components where the needle goes in there. You get the needle nut, and these three parts are responsible for the backwards and forwards motion, the spring, the cover, and the rod. This is quite clever because it can lock in a certain way where it stays open. And then we've got the famous nozzle attached to the trigger, and the tongue, which is always very difficult to handle. So with the lid off, that is everything pulled apart. Using petroleum jelly or Vaseline and Q-tips, we're going to grease up all the threads and reassemble it. Don't use too much grease, as it will affect airflow or paint flow. And we'll put back. Once we put back on the nozzle, as per demonstration, tighten it up. And when you get resistance, one finger, and that's it. Putting it together, we just go a little slower and just get familiar with all the components, lubricating each thread. You get really fast at it over time. The rear end, we like to put in quite a bit of lubricant, but not too much to interfere with the operations. There are more parts that come apart. There is a screwdriver flathead piece to take the thread out in the inside, and at the very back there is a screw with a washer behind it. That washer can be replaced for the seal from the back of the paint chamber. You don't have to replace that too often, but when that gets too loose, paint can flow backwards into the inner working areas. If you do put in a fair amount of lubricant, and if paint ever travels backwards, it will stay wet with the lubricant and never dry. The best thing about the lubricant is, with metal on metal, the slightest sniff of paint, even just pulling the needle back, will make pieces seize and just shatter, and you will not get any control or even operation out of the airbrush. With lubricant in there, pieces will be flowing freely for a very long time. Don't forget to put some down the hole of the air solenoid and in the valve around there. First thing we do is we put the tongue in. Now you want to make sure that the S bit, it looks like the letter S, is hooking on the back there. This can be very time consuming. Probably just with your fingers rub a little lubricant on it. There we go. It's sitting in there nice and tight. And then with our trigger, we put that very next. It is very important that the T-piece has a little bit of lube on it. The rest of it, not so much. This can take a little while and a lot of practice. Doesn't matter if it takes you 10 minutes, half an hour. But you just try to ease that brass bit right down the hole. You know that you've got it right when the brass is sticking out on the other side. We lubricate the thread of the solenoid, screw that in, and we know that we've got it right because when I push down, it springs straight back up. Next, we shall lubricate these three components. That makes everything, all the needle go backwards and forwards. We just ram a little bit of Vaseline in there, chuck in the spring, and grease up the whole piece. If paint gets anywhere as far as here, which it definitely should not, it'll always remain loose. And you can see that it's got quite a bit of pulling power. The thread can also do with a bit of greasing. And very gently, because we've got the tongue in there, and making sure that it's in there nice and flat, screw it in. And if the tongue is in there properly, it should flow backwards without any resistance, and the back end will stick out like that. Get the needle, lubricate the rear end only, and you should lubricate the rear end probably with every colour change and session. I don't exactly, but it just proves it. Push it in very slowly, making sure that you get no resistance. If you do, pull it out, check what's going on. And then you push it in all the way until it comes out of the nozzle. Not too much or you will shear the nozzle. Put the needle nut in. And it goes backwards and forwards. That needle going back pulls the needle out and it allows paint to go through, depending on how fine. Pushing it down gives us air, and it's absolutely ideal. We're going to rub it down with a tissue, give it a bit of a wash, rinse the cup with thinner, and we'll do some test lines. Okay, we've got it all hooked up, spraying quite nicely at about 14 psi. Gonna put in a bit of thinner. When you put your finger at the very end of the nozzle, you push the air down and you pull back. The air is escaping from the top, it's mixing the thinner throughout the airbrush, and it's great for cleaning out your airbrush or mixing paint. So we are good to go. Good technique for loading your airbrush, using a metal stick and paint and atomizing it down that. Before we spray on anything, we always test it off site to make sure it's working well. Now, I've just done a review for the Spa Max 3. We've got the Max 3 lines here, and we're going to test it with this airbrush. Now, the idea is when you're new to airbrushing, you lubricate it, you get familiar, you pull it apart a few times, and then you keep painting lines. The idea is to get a line as thin as something you get out of biro or a technical pencil or something. And you just try your very best to get a thin, well-controlled line without any splattering or anything. And you can see the lines compared to the Spa Max is just as thin, if not slightly thinner. There is very little to no splattering. It's almost just as smooth. And you can really control how thick or thin you want it to be. Now, doing some other tests, painting very thick lines is not a problem at all. And dusting on sort of works very, very well. And to colour an actual object in, works absolutely beautifully. It is not a bad airbrush. The maintenance bit is not as convenient as the Spa Max, though the results are pretty close and very good. You can get some excellent work. It is a lot smoother and easier to operate than a Hearns, even though the make of it is pretty much the same. Our next test after we clean it out will be to paint a model. When we empty our paint out into a jar, just wipe out with a tissue. Put some thinner in, bubble jet it, clean the needle. Making sure there's no more paint in it anymore. And we clean the nozzle area by pulling the pin back and wiping it out, maybe with some thinner. Pour the thinner in, finger on the end, pull back, bubble jet it, spray it out. I always recommend the use of one of these cleaning chambers. It's a good stand and it also takes your waste. Spray a bit out, dispose of the rest, and you keep repeating that process until the inner part is completely clean. So with the signature airbrush, I've loaded it with some light primer, and it's got amazing control. You can do all sorts of fine stuff. Pull back, it has absolutely beautiful coverage. It just goes on ever so slightly softish. There is no spluttering, unlike the 2.0 one. We had a little problem at first, but 14 psi. When you pull back really far, it comes out really heavy. About a quarter or a half, and that's just enough to dust it on in tiny layers. So, it goes on almost pretty dry, and you can almost touch it immediately as soon as you're finished airbrushing. And that's the ideal way to airbrush. You just do a few passes. You just want to change the colour ever so slowly, ever so carefully, and you can colour in nicely. It's also got amazing control. If you really pull back and only spray a tiny amount, you could actually just colour in panels without overspraying too much, which is good practice. I'm just going to paint the barrel and nothing else. You can see the other half or end of the barrel has got nothing. It's not too bad at all. And then we just colour in the rest by dusting on lightly at all angles. It's a very, very smooth airbrush. It's extremely impressive. I really, really like it, and would definitely recommend it as a beginner or something just for priming and base coat. Can't complain whatsoever. We'll do some shading in the next segment of the same tank. So we're doing some colour modulation. Now we've got a very tight control, and we can very lightly add a small line, such as on this piece of paper. I could do a really, really, really fine thin line, and I can just blend in the darker green with the lighter green that I've got in my airbrush, and it gives me that very good control without actually spluttering or causing any effect. And when I want to blend it all together, I go back and I just shade and colour it in. So it's pretty good for priming, it's pretty good for top coating, it's pretty good for your base painting. And you can see that because of the needle nozzle and mechanisms, after that it's gotten its treatment with the lubricant, it's just incredibly smooth, and it's got a lovely large spray pattern. So you can't really complain whatsoever with this price tag. The control is just top notch. So we have a new colour, a lighter one. which looks pretty good. And we're just going to add highlights to the top and some of the bits of the side of the tank. Only holding the trigger back really finely and going in pretty close. Might need a bit more thinner. So we've thinned it even thinner. It's almost completely transparent. And what we're going to do is just ever so slightly draw really faint lines in certain areas, highlighting top parts of the armour, just to give it a little bit of variation. And this way it does not look like a flat 2D toy. And then we just pick the top of certain boxes and whatnot. And then there you go, you got a nicely shaded tank. No splattering. You can see that how certain boxes, round shapes, domes are sort of picked up. When you look at the side, it gets darker and more intense slower, but it's lighter and more interesting looking at the top. Later on, once we have the second camouflage colour on, which the masking will be involved, black and soot will be used to shade underneath the wheel wells and whatnot to create shadows. But this can only occur once the whole model is really close to being done. And that way it's going to add some really nice natural lighting effects as well as weathering and smoke. So after a while we're going to do the same 3 tones all over again, and we're going to just slowly dust on the paint. I've got a bit more control over the thinning. It's nice and watered down, very slick. It's looking alright. And we're starting the low lights with a darker brown colour, and then we're just going to work our way around as per the other colours. So we've got another colour. It's a bit lighter. And we're going to be painting in the top direction. We painted underneath to get all the shadows. And now I'm going to very carefully paint the lighter colour, or the middle colour, in areas that it's not going to affect the shadows. And do it in really thin lines and not overly saturate, due to the amount of control this airbrush has. Which is very impressive, by the way. With the lightest colour, I'm going around and just highlighting the very top areas. I've got just tan, very light colour compared to the other 3, and it's just all the top bits that are creating a very fine modular effect. Because this paint is thinner than the others, the difference is very subtle. Now, there's a lot of surface detail, so the areas that are high boxes I'm going to delicately pick out, and just the more centre of the box I'm going to go intense and then go back and then just highlight it. And then you go back and you dust a tiny bit on. Go in, pick little details. It doesn't look very obvious now, but it will stand out later when there's washes and everything's on there. So we won't deal too much with the slope armour. The underbits are dark, the middle's normal, the top's light, and it's already looking pretty good. Now with the very top bit, most of it is going to be really light because it's a little higher than everything else. And we're just going to dust. And then there's just a really, really subtle yet awesome difference. Then we go back, and then we just dust down. And that's looking pretty good. So the final step, what we're going to do is with very heavily thin black, we're going to shade the underneath. And you can see that we can very gently, without splattering, change the colours. And build up where appropriate. See, it's a nice toning colour, and that way we add modulation and all sorts of interesting effects. As well as doing the wheels, you can darken the end of the barrel a bit. And anywhere where there are vents, you just slowly build up and then go in and darken the center of it. I'm just going to go around and weather and make it look interesting. This is the conclusion of the signature 0.3mm airbrush, very similar to the Hearns or Sparmax DH-103. I used it a bit longer as 0.3 is my workhorse, and left it in the studio for about a month and a half in between painting this tank. I've also painted all of these components, which involves all sorts of shading and masking and whatnot. I feel very comfortable with it. It's very, very well made. It does feel very similar, or more so closer to a Sparmax than a Hearns, or at least my old DH-103. Very, very smooth to operate. The cup is quite smooth. It's quick-ish to clean. It's not, the chemicals are not reacting with the electroplate, so it's not lifting in a month of fairly hectic and constant use. I'm fairly impressed with it. It's operating and working quite well. After lubing it up, it's more or less every second day, a good hour pumping out of it. So it's going quite strong, and it's everything that I expect out of an airbrush like this. As you can see with this, this is the sort of work you can get. This is a masked kit, but with three-hand camouflage and that sort of stuff, it works just as superiorly. I do highly recommend it. Links down below to where you can get it. If you're in Australia and whatnot, it retails around the $40 mark. I definitely highly enjoy it. It's absolutely perfect as a beginner's airbrush, as well as a second airbrush or a workhorse for someone more experienced. Pairs very, very nicely with the 0.2mm in the signature range, if you're willing to use this for colouring in, shading, top coats, primer, and your other one for your more fine detail, freehand blending work. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and as always, until next time, stay tuned for more videos, and we'll definitely catch you guys later. Check out Facebook every few days. Lately I've been posting content on there of work in progress, pictures, resources, videos, other things I'm doing on other platforms. Twitch, I occasionally do live streams. I talk, I do Q&As, I model in lifetime. Patreon, it's just a tip jar, nothing special. And that's pretty much a roundup of everything. If you leave a comment in the form of a question or ask a question in a PM on any platform, I am more than happy to always answer it. Catch you guys next time.